Good day, everybody, and welcome to another very exciting episode of RowingChat. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the show Penny Chuter. Hello, Penny.
Hi, how are you?
We are super, and we're really looking forward to hearing a little bit about you and your history in the sport of rowing, because your name may not be familiar to many people, but when I first started in the sport, you were the lady who was the chief selector and chief coach for British rowing. So would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got started in rowing and your background in the sport?
Okay, let's plow in. It was a very, very long time ago. I was always, I think, due to be what we call, in England at least, a wet bob, because I had to row across the river to my primary school every day from the age of 4 to the age of 11. And I mucked about in all sorts of boats on the river. And in those days, all the people who could afford to live beside the River Thames actually used it mainly in boats that weren't powered by engines. And therefore we played about in canoes and punts and rafts and whatever. My mother was an international swimmer. My father was a sailor. So all these things are fairly watery. And my parents had bought a small riverside bungalow towards the end of the war. When my father was demobbed from the Navy, they decided to move out of the bomb sites of West London and live in this little bungalow. And that is why it was quicker for me from that bungalow to row across the Thames to school every day, rather than walk about 5 miles across farmyards to get to a bus. So that's how I sort of started rowing. On that particular reach of the Thames, there were 2 clubs, Burway Rowing Club and Leyland Skiff and Punting Club. The former was then a men's only club, but was one of the very early ones to go mixed. And the latter one, the Skiffing and Punting Club, was mixed. And I joined that at the age of 12, started punting, became the Thames punting champion, moved on at the same time to skiffing in a fixed seat Thames skiff, and again became champions in that sport. And then I took up single sculling, fine boat sculling. I was British champion for 5 years. And I went to the European Championships, those 5 years, 1960, 64, and managed to win a silver medal. My whole life is surrounded by silvers, not bronzes or golds, always silvers, both in coaching and myself. So that's how I took up single sculling. It was a bit of a bet. I beat the British champion in the Thames fixed seat skiff. My coach said, well, you've beaten her in a fixed seat skiff. If you can beat her in a shell sliding seat single, you'll go to the Rome Olympics. Little did my club coach know there were no women in the Olympics in 1960. However, I got myself into a single sculling boat and did my 5 years, and managed to get a silver. I then, having had my final 2 years, my profile was I came 4th, 4th, 2nd, 4th, 4th. So I was a bit disgruntled the last 2 years where we had diabolically unfair conditions and none of all the things that I was instrumental in trying to get FISA to do, like semi-finalists going into the centre line, so you have a chevron effect in the final, the Fairness Commission, things like that. And so I decided I'd just stop. I wasn't going to continue on in this sort of situation. It was just too expensive for me because we had to pay for everything. And I went off to physical education college to train as a physical education teacher for 3 years. And that is relevant because I was being trained as a teacher, not specifically as a high performance coach, but as a teacher. I then taught in 2 schools for 7 years. The second school I hated from about half term onwards, but it brought me back to the Thames near Reading. In fact, not very far from the Redgrave and Pinsent Caversham Lake, where the national team train now. And so some boys at the school rowed and said, "Miss, would you give us some coaching?" So I said, "I'm not a qualified coach, but I'll go on a course first and I'll coach you after Christmas." And I went on the first ever silver level course in coach education for rowing. And dare I say, I managed to come top. Bob Janasek, our chief coach at the time, marked the written paper. And when I was later employed by the ARA, now British Rowing, he showed me my exam paper and I actually got 100%, I have to say. But it was a convenient time because I didn't know that what is now British Rowing were advertising for a full-time women's national coach to start the women's national training system as the men had, because of course FISA had just got women's rowing into the Montreal Olympics in '76. They had to run 2 world championships, and up until and including '73 they were always called Europeans for the women. And so we had 2 world championships, '74 and '75. And Bob Janasek whispered in my ear that soon after Christmas and after the course, there would be this advert out, and why don't I apply? I decided I wasn't going to stay at that school, and so I was getting ramped up anyway to go for interviews again. So I thought, well, I don't stand a chance in hell as a female. But there we go. I'll give it a try. Why not? It's good interview experience. So I went for an interview and got the job. And probably that's a good start. I could sort of go through my various roles at British Rowing, but probably that's long enough.
Well, that's a brilliant, brilliant background. And of course, you highlight so many things that rowers of today take for granted. For example, as you said, the FISA work on fairness in racing, and secondly, coach education, and thirdly, the perception that women can't coach men, for example. But I'd like to talk a little bit first about your transition from being an athlete to being a coach, because I am going to make some rash guesses. I've done a little skiffing in my time and I'm not a punting expert, but for those who have never punted, a punt is a long boat which is around 18 inches to 2 feet wide, and you propel it with an extremely long pole, and races are done over a fixed distance where you lap backwards and forwards. So you pass a fixed point, turn the boat around basically by just reversing it because it goes in both directions, and going in the opposite direction, and it's extremely challenging and they're very tippy. But you would have had some coaching, Penny, when you were at the skiff club. Can you remember who taught you and the things that you later relied on when you became a coach?
Well, this was the club coach, Neville Mulroy, who I did my first year in a punt in the mixed doubles. I actually punted with him. The racing punts, as you said, there were 2 basic types. One was, and they were always called by their width. There was the 2-foot punt, which is 2 foot wide, and that was in later times just used for doubles and singles. And then there was what was called a best and best punt, just like fine boats, as they, basically came finer and lighter and more difficult to balance, were also called fine boats or best boats or best and best boats. And so these, the narrowest you could get was dependent on the length of your foot with your shoes on. because you stand not like they do at Oxford and Cambridge, stood on the back counter facing forward and trying to punt sideways whilst facing forward. You actually stood sideways in the boat, and therefore the narrowest you could have for the fastest possible best boat. So my punt was 10 inches internal width, and they had a flat bottom. The definition of a punt is that it has a sort of letterbox flat counter each end, vertical sides and a flat bottom. Now that means it would just slide everywhere when you punted it on one side. And so when you punted, you put the weight on your toes facing sideways and tip the boat over, so you got effectively a V shape. But as you know, a V shape is quite unstable as well, but at least it gave you a cutting edge to steer with.
Fantastic.
And actually, that, of all the water sports I've done, including sailing and canoeing and rowing and whatever in loads of different boats, punting was the most difficult because it was the most open. We're talking skill learning about open skills and closed skills. And in rowing, if you like, on a mill pond, it would be fairly closed. If you row in really rough water, the skill factor becomes more open because you never know what's happening with the next wave. And of course, in punting, as you went along the shelf on the side of the Thames, you would never know what was on the bottom next stroke, how deep the water was, whether you're going to hit a boulder, mud, or whatever. So every time you threw that pole down, which is a bit like a pole vault pole, you know, you never know how long before it hit the bottom, etc. And steering was more difficult as well. So the punting really gave me a good base.
Fantastic. I love your concept of open and closed skills. That's the first time I've heard it. And I'm guessing...
Oh, not mine.
I'm guessing you watched the Rio Olympics and the early heats where it was quite challenging water conditions, and it became abundantly clear which athletes had the skill to race in bumpy water and which ones did not.
Yeah. A clear example was Kim Brennan in the single sculls. You know, on flat, calm water in the final, she was fine. But in that really, really rough water, that brings me on to another aspect of flow patterns in athletes as opposed to rhythm, which we might come back to on another topic, but leave it for the minute.
Oh, no, talk now. Tell us about flow patterns.
Well, one of the things that I have applied to the coaching of rowing that I learned at Physical Education College, we had to do contemporary dance, modern educational dance, and study Laban movement theory and all the rest of it. And these concepts of the various qualities of movement, two of which are related to flow, bound flow and free flow. Now, we did a lot in the early 80s, and maybe they still do. When I was working with Mike Spracklin, we did quite a lot of pairs matrices. I don't know if you've heard of those, where you just maybe take 16 rowers, 8 bow side, 8 stroke side, and you do a series of 1250 meters or 1500 meters in a time trial setup. And all the bowsiders in rotation, one race after the other, come in, switch partners, row. So every bowsider rows with every stroke sider and vice versa. And apart from the actual results of which pairs go the fastest of all those combinations, you also can do a lot of analysis of which individual athletes fit in with everybody, and which individual athletes don't fit in with anybody at all, and which fit in with some people and not others. And free flow movers fit in with everybody. We talk about units, crews made in heaven. they always go faster than the sum of the parts. And other crews that are made in hell because they've got somebody in the crew that we may call an anchor, or we may call a boat stopper. And pairs matrix, apart from other things, are very good for learning a great deal about flow of athletes. And very often, if you take pairs and doubles particularly, and you see somebody going extremely well in a pair, and then one of them retires and they bring in a new partner, and with the new partner who's physiologically just as good, and in other boats with other people may have gone extremely well, it just doesn't go so well. And so it's very difficult for two very bound flow movers to fit together. It's very easy for two free flow movers to fit together immediately. And this is obviously apart from their physiology and their physique and their technical ability, and it's not related directly to rhythm. But for example, a bound flow mover can easily lead at stroke, but can't follow. Remember Pinsent and Redgrave? Redgrave's a big guy, but he's a free flow mover. Pinsent is an outstanding athlete as well, and he's not extremely bound flow, but he's more bound. And when he was first tried after my time in the pair, Redgrave being the senior of the two with the Olympic gold medals, he stroked, and he can stroke, he's an excellent stroke, and that pair wasn't going so well because Matthew was following. Yet as juniors, Matthew had won a senior medal with Tim Foster. Again, Matthew was stroking, and Tim Foster, who's a free flow mover, was following. And as soon as that pair of Pinsent and Redgrave would change round, with Pinsent stroking and Redgrave following, it was great. So that's an example whereby sometimes when you put the best physiological specimens together in a boat, why doesn't it go? And I've always had a particular interest in flow qualities in athletes. And I don't know why, I seem to be able to just see them. I can even watch, Sarasota 2 weeks ago and just see these sorts of things. Now, everyone's on a continuum, and I'm sort of talking in the extremes. And many people are going to be in the middle of that continuum. But you do get into problems when you get in rowing extremely bound flow movers.
So tell me, imagine I'm a club rowing coach and I'm interested in what you've described here. What should I look for in order to try and make an assessment about my athletes as to whether they're bound flow movers or free flow movers, or where they are on your continuum?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit difficult in terms of the continuum, but something's wrong if a boat who have got good physiological people in it and whose technical ability is pretty good, and if the boat doesn't go, it's probably related to flow factors, much more than psychological factors. In fact, I believe that if two people hate each other, but they know that that's the partner for them if they want to win an Olympic gold medal, they'll get on with it. But if they're not physically compatible, then the boat still won't go. So it's very difficult if you haven't been trained in movement qualities and dance and things, which would distract the club level coach completely. It's not easy, but the way to do it is when you're trying combinations out, if you do seat racing, which is another method, and I only ever use that as a last resort, and it's not a good thing. I don't think it works as well if all the athletes know each other. If you have a group of athletes like selecting juniors who come together and only one or two of them know each other, and you've got 40 of them, and you've got to make decisions very quickly at the last minute, then they can't manipulate or attempt to manipulate anything in seat racing if they don't know enough about all the other people taking part. But even in seat racing, And a pairs matrix is almost like a seat racing, but in pairs. And you can have doubles matrices as well, but you don't have to worry about the sided factor. You can just, you know, why is it that you can race 8 single scullers off, then you can put, from those 8, you can take the best 2 and put them in a double, the second best, numbers 3 and 4 in another double, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 in 4 doubles. And why is it sometimes that the double with the best 2 in don't win? They definitely are the best in the single, where the flow factor doesn't encroach on the other person. And I think as a coach, you just have to experiment with combinations and try to see why. But a more simple way of describing flow is that someone who looks more contained, some coaches might call it tense or over controlled, whereas others can just get in the boat. I was still coaching on FISA development camps in Seville up to 3 years ago, and the guy that got the silver medal in Sarasota, the Cuban guy,
Angel Rodriguez.
Angel Rodriguez, whatever, Fournier. I was coaching him just for the first 3 days of the camp, waiting for another sculling coach to come and take on that particular group. And I have never known any person ever in my life so relaxed as him. He could actually go out and do 24 kilometers at Seville. And during the training, he would take the catch, he would take one hand right off the scull and dangle it in the water to cool it down during the dry phase, put it back on the scull and continue. There was just no tension at all. And he could do it because he was so relaxed that although he'd only got one scull during the dry phase squared in the water, the other one was there without his hand on the handle, and he just took his hand off, dangled it in the water, put it back on again, and just carried on with hardly an interruption. Absolutely amazing.
Wow.
So another way is for more experienced coaches to just point out who are free flow and who are bound flow. The coaches may not talk in my terms. They may can talk and say that person's a bit more controlled, or he tightens up, and you named it. Another thing is that people who tighten up a lot in rough water will very often be more bound flow people.
I remember vividly they had a World Cup at Princeton in the USA about probably 18 years ago, and the conditions during the finals were really challenging. It was a crosswind, and I remembered watching the British men's lightweight 4, which a friend of mine was rowing in, and seeing how they were zigzagging down the lane because they were failing to cope well. But at that same regatta, I saw Olaf Tufte win the single sculls. And I remember looking at how he moved and how he was totally undisturbed by the water conditions, and saying to my friend at the time, I think that's the guy who's going to win the Olympic gold medal.
But you can take, I mean, I wouldn't class him as particularly free flow. He's not extremely bound either. And, you know, he was around because he's been around a long time, just about in my time, because although I worked for FISA a long time after I left British rowing, so I was still involved on the international scene and following all these international athletes. But he is another one who, and Pertti Karppinen is one of the obvious people. He was 3 times Olympic gold medal in a single scull. And then when he started getting a bit older, he started trying in a double with his brother. Same family. It just never really went anywhere. It's just amazing. And he was definitely bound flow. But in a single, it doesn't really matter, except when you get to a more open skill situation, in simple language, rough water or tidal water with currents or whatever, and then those people who are extremely bound flow. And you see, if you applied it to canoeing, and I used to be a canoe instructor just at school level as well, or club level, if you like, a senior canoe instructor, because in kayaking, for example, you strike 120 strokes a minute as opposed to 30 to 40, then the flow factor doesn't really come into it. But in rowing, it absolutely does, because you've got a drive phase and a recovery phase. And it's another way that these free flow movers can let the boat do the work on the recovery. But if you were to put the downside of an extremely free flow mover, you could actually say, instead of being over controlled like the bound flow, they don't have enough control. So if anything, you're forever telling them, you know, they think time on the slide is time wasted, and they're rushing up and down the slide out of control. And if they're extremely free flow, then you have got to discipline their movement language, if you like.
That's a really, really accurate description. So let's go right back to when people are first learning in a rowing boat. Is there anything a coach can do to encourage them to acquire some of these flow skills? Because I'm going to guess that some people find it naturally easier, but there are some things that can be coached onto you. What would you recommend?
Well, I would say that rather like your writing, your handwriting and your signature, by the way, that's another way you can tell people's flow, by watching their writing. You can see someone with a bound flow writing and free flow writing. You know, big, loopy, flowy, that's a free flow mover, and really tight and erratic sort of writing, that's a bound flow mover. But it's a movement signature, it's a movement pattern, and you can't change it. Wherever you sit along that continuum, you can't really change it. Back to your example of the rough water. You know, yes, a single sculler will get more confident in time, just as they get more experience in racing, and they get more confident that, you know, whilst the pain is absolutely killing me, I've done this before and I know I can push on through this and blah, blah, blah. Then equally, the more often you row in rough water, the better you will be able to cope with it. But modification of that basic movement signature is limited. I mean, yes, all the skills, when it came out of Ratzeburg, first of all these things that they now do on our rowing instructors course and whatever, standing on your head, standing up, turning all the way around, sitting down again, all that I wrote into our rowing instructors award, as it was called then, in 1977, all those balance skills are all designed. They can still be made competitive. How many times can you do this? You know, for how long can you balance this or whatever? But they're nothing to do with actually moving a boat fast in a straight line. They're just getting used to the boat, what its limitations are. And I think always the coach realizing that the biggest instructor is the single sculling boat. Not necessarily ideal for adults, but certainly for youngsters who don't have any inhibitions and whose balance skills are going to, you know, mature around 8 to 12 years old, then that's the time to do all that. And if that's when they're going to get relaxed and easy on the water, I think that's the time.
I think that's a great insight. And of course, the challenge for a rowing club is our boats are not designed for athletes who are 25 to 35 kgs in weight and, as you say, age of that age group. I used to teach 10 to 14-year-olds at Tideway Scullers, and we cut down some sculls for them, but their hands were too small to grip a scull handle. And they all sculled with their thumb on top of the handle, which was great because you can't have a tense grip with your thumb on the top.
Yeah.
So I'd like to move on to talking a little bit about the era of international racing, when it was before the national lottery, before the athletes were paid and the coaches were supported, but it was a very, very different world from the one that we had today. So how was the ARA internationally run when you were working there?
Well, I think virtually for the whole of my time, we were in a big transition. The situation in our country and everywhere in the world in the early 70s, and I actually started in the autumn of 73-4, was that everyone had selection boards for the men and for the women, and basically all the best club crews or university crews would attend trials, often the best of 3 in the spring, and the selector's job was simply to organize this mini regatta, and whichever crew crossed the line first twice out of 3 times would get selected. But of course, when the Soviet bloc, Eastern Bloc, started developing squad systems, bringing in athletes as individuals, then they were getting all their best athletes in one boat, and then the next best athletes in the next best boat, and so on, long before we were. And this was why, you know, in Britain we were saying, you know, when I started as a national coach, and Bob Janasek took me aside and he said, you know, he said, you're going to have a real uphill struggle being a female. But he said, I can't help you very much, although I'd love to. I've got my own problems because, you know, I'm perceived as a communist. And what can those people from Czechoslovakia teach us in Great Britain how to row? We invented the sport sort of attitude. So things had to change. And when I started the women, we tried immediately to have a squad system for all crews, but very little money. And to start with, absolutely no talent at all. I just grabbed the people off the local clubs who would volunteer in, and slowly built on from there. And of course, it was a long time after my time as the women's coach that the women started producing medals of any description. So it was a long process. But with the women, we couldn't exclusively. We had to make exceptions and have some open trials now and then. And Bob Janasek had already started the system, I think the year after the Munich Olympics. I think it was also 73-74. And again, it wasn't a full squad system. He basically ran a squad that would produce the 8 and 2 4s, or vice versa. And there was a set double scull that won a bronze medal. That's Chris Bailey and Mike Hart in Moscow in 73. And they were a set double. They'd won a bronze medal, which was better than anybody else had done in recent years in British rowing. And so they were left and supported as a unit. So really, all the other boats outside Bob's little group, were still selected by open trials.
And they were club.
So we still had, sorry?
They were club crews, effectively, training in their club.
Often university crews and or club crews. Yeah. And Bob just ran a squad to try to produce 1 or 2, or at best 3 boats of what was then 8 boats for the open weight men. And so when I became the men's chief coach, I was still continuing to try to get more boats selected by the squad system and less by the open system. but selectors are very powerful people. And my hypothesis was that in a squad system where individual athletes come in and they register as individuals and they are assessed and whatever and tried in crew combinations as individuals, that selection is just the outcome or end process of the coaching process, and therefore the selection should be done by the coaches that have been training the athletes and knew which one was which. And what we still had is this process, and then a selection panel would come along at the end and say, well, maybe we'll have that guy with the red hair in that boat and that guy whatever in that boat, and so on. And so for a while there was this, from the start of some squad boats, we had sort of unhappy bedfellows between who should be selecting coaches. And it was, I finally sort of made progress, and in the year of 1984 Olympics, they decided to scrub individual selection boards, not for the they did all of them just for a year. And the long and the short of it was a disaster, and it's certainly not what I was recommending, because you had a selection board with 3 for juniors, 3 doing men, 3 doing women, and when they voted as a whole, the majority weren't experts on that particular squad. So you had 3 women selectors and 3 junior selectors voting on the men, and there was only 3 men selectors, and that didn't work at all. And the good outcome of that was that in the following year there weren't any selection boards, and the performance director, director of international, chief coach or whatever was the selector, but not alone. I was always there as the big baddie, but the fact was, behind the scenes, it was the group of coaches in the men's squad and the group of coaches in the women's squad that were running all the assessment trials, doing all the technical coaching, implementing the training program and all the rest of it. And slowly but surely, at the end of the day, after all these assessments and trials or whatever within the squad, we would come out with crews. And I think it wasn't until 86 probably, and by then we had lightweight women as well, so we had a lightweight women's squad, where we did have the first, what I call holistic selection policy for the whole of the seniors. We still had to keep the juniors separate because it was so different. Our problems in the juniors were different, and so we dispensed with selection boards for good. We had all boats individual registration into each squad. We produced strategy documents for each squad. We had written down selection criteria, standards and targets to go for, and then there were a series of mandatory assessments. And actually, it's very much as it is now, to be honest. Those coaches like David Tanner, who's now the performance director, and Ron Needs, alas no longer with us, but many others had come up through that system with me. And of course, since then, with all the lottery funding, it's been refined and it's been supported with all this funding, and the athletes no longer had to pay or whatever. So it was an ongoing process. But I think the key thing was the initial agreement that we should run squads with individual registration, and then stopping all this separate men, separate women, separate lightweights and all the rest of it, and having a combined senior selection program, I should say. And so that was, if you like, what I was trying to do over a number of years. I can talk about the sort of things we did in the trials. And some of our tools I've already mentioned, like a pairs matrix, we used a lot. A little bit of seat racing. It was used more in the juniors, and it may still be used in the juniors. But more or less we had sort of 2 or 3 assessments, long distance assessments in small boats. But of course, when I suggested that all these assessments should be in singles, doubles and pairs, I mean, everybody, but we can't row singles, doubles and pairs, and we haven't got those boats. We've only got 8s and Cox 4s. And so that was an ongoing process as well, of getting all the clubs to get hold of pairs and learn to work and move in pairs. And all that was an ongoing process over those years. So that now that's still what they do. They have trial long distance assessments in singles, doubles and pairs. After a few years, I decided that the previous year's team didn't have to attend the first one, which I think they still do, and then everyone would attend the second one. The first one was focused on any newcomers, and anybody from any club could still turn up, and I think they still can in a pair, and they may not get further than the first assessment, but at least they can probably turn up.
They have to do an ergo test on the first night, and that, I think, reduces the numbers somewhat.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, a whole variety of things like that.
Very, very good, because I certainly, when I was going to those long distance assessments, we were definitely doing it in pairs. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about your more recent boat coaching in Cornwall, which is where you live now. And you've got involved with the local Cornish Pilot Gig scene, perhaps I can call it. Tell everybody a little bit about what they are as boats and what sorts of races they do.
Well, I think, as may have come across already, I'm, as soon as anybody puts me in or gives me to coach any sort of boat, I am immediately really stimulated, not just by how to get the best out of the athletes, but how to get the best out of this particular boat. And my recreational sport is sailing. And the south coast of Cornwall is an absolute paradise for sailing. And so when I retired, I came down here mainly for the sailing, and I had a small yacht and whatever. And one summer I had problems with the keel of my yacht, and she was out of the water. And I was twiddling my thumbs with what to do. And so I decided I'd join the local gig club, which I'm still a member of. And I rowed out this morning, not in a gig, but in a ladies' double scull, ladies' geriatric double scull, in a 15-foot skiff. So I immediately was intrigued by these boats and how the best to get, you know, the most out of them. They're 32 feet long. They're clinker built. They have quite high sides or gunnels because they're made for the sea. Their design is such that they're absolutely designed for what we call in the West Country the long Cornish rollers. They start in the Caribbean and they roll across the Atlantic and hit us first. By the time you get up towards the east, the southeast coast of the UK, you have much shorter, choppier water. So these boats are designed for that. And if anyone's coming to Henley Royal Regatta next year, if you go to the River and Rowing Museum, you'll see the first ever Oxford and Cambridge boat race. I'm not very good on dates, 1829, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Hanging upside down. Well, I think that belonged to an Oxford college before it was used for that first boat race. And at that college, as many boatyards on the Thames, there was a big exchange between boatyards on the coast and boatyards on the Thames. And would you believe that boat for 8 is almost exactly the same as a Cornish Pilot Gig? Not that unusual when you realise that there was this constant exchange between a boatyard in Falmouth, I understand, or certainly somewhere along the south coast of Cornwall, with Oxford colleges. and the assistant boat builder was from Falmouth in Cornwall, and he obviously had a lot to do with the design of that particularly first boat. So the first ever Oxford and Cambridge boat race, the Oxford boat, and there was replicas of them. They may still be there at Eton Dorney on the 2012 Olympic course. There's still 2 of them there. So that's basically what a Cornish Pilot Gigs looks like. And the big challenge is that it's fixed pin, it's fixed seat. The sleeves on the oars do not have a flat back, so the profile is not D-shaped as in sliding seat rowing. And therefore, effectively, you've got a round sleeve in a square hole. And after the 2012 Olympics, Annie Vernon, who's a Cornish girl herself and Olympic silver medalist, she brought down some of the women's squad from 2012, and we had a fun evening at St Maur's near Falmouth. But of course, the sliding seat rowers couldn't cope, because they just couldn't cope with no collar and basically a round sleeve in a square hole. It was nothing to do with the heavy boats, nothing to do with fixed seat. It was really handling this oar, which is very difficult. And the unusual thing is that 99.9% of these rowers, since the mid-70s, have rowed underhand grip with the outside hand. The only club that doesn't, exactly that, the only club that doesn't is my club, where we have a mixture. All our learn to row courses are run overhand grip. Anyone that joins from another club who can already row usually wants to stay the way they are. And of course, there were those that were there before my time also. So some of them changed. I have a little exercise I can easily do to convince anybody that it's not a good idea to row underhand grip. But when they're all doing it against each other, it's a brave club, a brave crew, or a brave individual to make that change, particularly without any guidance at all. And yet they all train on rowing machines, and they all row on them overhand grip. Obviously, they're not rowing sweep or whatever, but you know, they're all overhand grip.
So what's your little test?
Well, if you do standard exercise, square blade paddling, inside, remember they row underhand grip with the outside hand. So if you just normally, you would row square blade, outside hand only, because you don't feather with the outside hand, you feather with the inside hand. So I always do square blade if it's outside hand only, because you need to lean in towards the middle of the boat, because you sit on the opposite side of the boat to where your oar is, to where your pins are, and that effectively gives you your inboard span or spread. So you need to lean in, because the oar is at quite a steep angle and it helps keep the blade under the water if you lean in a bit. So rather than ask them to put their inside hand behind their back, I get them to drop it down in front of the thwart, which helps them to lower their inside shoulder. And then, so those that are underhand grip are then trying to row with one hand only, underhand grip, and they're very lucky if they can do 10 strokes. So I then say, okay, hands back on. We're going to try again this time, but before you do, we're going to put the underhand grip, the outside hand, on top, and you will do the same exercise. Take your inside hand off, square blade only, and they can go on for hours. Now that's just a simple example. I mean, I can make the rationale, you know, biceps don't work well when your arm is locked straight. They always want to bend slightly. You can't put any power through the outside shoulder. You can't extract the blade properly, because effectively what you're doing is you're drawing through about 3/4 of the way through the drive phase. You actually turn your hand over and flip it over like that. And this was all developed, and it's a real red herring in my view, but it was all developed by this other form of Cornish rowing that we have, the Cornish Rowing Association, and they row these 18 and 15-foot boats, which you're really squashed in them. And they have this problem that you're always hitting the person in front. And so what they developed, one particular club developed, is, okay, if we reduce our inboard length, we can row past our bodies at the finish. And the rowing past the bodies was what developed this underhand grip, because they effectively pull for 3/4 with their hand under, and on the last little bit as it goes past their bodies, they flip it over. Well, I think in terms of progress, because I did run the first 2 fixed seat courses in the UK, having rowed all these grips and these boats and sliding seat. And so I ran the first level 2 and the first level 3 fixed seat courses in Cornwall for British rowing, and was fairly controversial, mainly to get the coaches to think out of the box. And you know, I came up with all the rationale or whatever, but as I say, it's a brave person to change it. But it all stemmed from the shortening of the inboard. Now, what I have accepted is, with these gigs and in most forms of fixed seat rowing that don't involve sculling, in other words, sweep, if you have an inboard long enough to take your outside hand to the outside of the body at the finish, your finish would be much too short. Which is perhaps why they developed shorter inboards, so they could row past. So the compromise really is to row to the center line of the body, which means your outside hand will rotate. You know, if your inboards are too short, your outside hand will rotate round the end of the oar. And so to a point, you have to accept a little bit of rotation round with your hand on the top. But I've rowed in the World Championships, the Cornish Pilot Gig World Championships, and managed at the age of almost 70 to come 35th out of 115, which I thought was not too bad. And I was the only one in my crew and in the whole event, I probably rowing overhand grip. But now we do have quite a lot of rowers, and all our learn to row graduates, as it were, row overhand grip, but we are the only club that does.
Congratulations.
But at least what you do see now, when you look at all the top crews, as I did 2 weeks ago, all of the top 50% of crews are rowing, not overhand grip, but they are rowing to the center line of the boat. They've got longer inboards again, and they've stopped rowing this round to the side. And we all know in rowing, and whether it's in a Cornish Pilot Gig or an 8 or a pair or whatever, that you don't really need to be rowing more than 45 degrees at the finish of the stroke. And in an 8, you know, you may be from the orthogonal, the 90-degree point of the oar, to the extraction, it might only be 37 degrees. So we have stopped all this, because once you get past that point, basically the boat, the speed of the boat is towing the blades out of the inside of the puddles. You're not moving the boat at all.
You're slowing it down.
Yeah, they have moved in that direction, but I'm not waving any banners about it. But I've really found it extremely interesting from a technical point of view of how best to move these boats, both in terms of what you do with your hands, but the whole body technique and whatever.
Fascinating.
And I love the sport. It's fantastic. Going out on the harbour in the morning, sun rising, or in the evening, or whatever, just great.
I love the fact that it's a boat club that is very little hindered by weather. Of course, fine boat rowing, we are very challenged because we don't have very high-sided boats.
Yeah.
Now, Penny, you mentioned your work with FISA, the International Rowing Federation. Can you tell me the story behind the establishment of the Fairness Commission?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I started on the Women's Commission. I think I was there until 77 or 78. And then when I moved to what was called the Men's Commission, but was actually the Competitive Rowing Commission, which was then chaired by Tor Nielsen, who I worked with for many, many years. And he was probably my main mentor, along with Bob Janasek in the UK. And I suppose I was still, if you like, there initially representing the women's side of things on the competition commission. And so I continued to fight for improving the women's situation, boat classes, you know, umpires still joking about the most difficult races to umpire for the women's pairs because of the steering, which, you know, getting rid of the cocks in the quad, because of course traditionally in my time the women's quad was a cocked boat and women couldn't possibly steer quads. And my experience is there are people that have no idea where they are on the water or in space, and there are people who do have. And never mind what seat they're sitting in, those people that are good at steering, male or female, are going to be good at steering. So, you know, we had to get rid of all that sort of business. And then, of course, we started developing the World Cups in the, I think, the early 80s-ish. And they first started, if you remember, as singles, in singles only, World Cup singles. And this enabled us to experiment with all sorts of things. And gradually out of that and the World Cups, FISA had a disaster. Martin Cross, you'll know Marty Crossy, or whatever he calls himself these days, doing the commentaries on the for FISA and whatever this year, I think, in Sarasota, and for many years now. He'll remember 1987 in Copenhagen, when it was just so unfair, the conditions, it wasn't true. And at the end of his, I think it was his final, I can't remember if it was in the Cox 4 or the Coxless 4, he was stroking the boat and he put his hand up for the umpire to come up to him. And he said, "Umpire, I've just taken part in a completely and absolutely unfair race, and I'd like to challenge it." And of course it was all overruled, and that was the end of that. But it got to a point, I think, that FISA accepted that we had to improve the competitive racing conditions. And with that came the introduction of the Fairness Commission and the introduction of seeding, both of which I was, you know, having had my last 2 European championships myself, literally ruled out of medals with not a chance in hell of getting a medal because of the lane I was drawn in the final. I was really keen to improve all these things, and so pushed really hard for it. And the World Cups, which were run by FISA, not just World Championships and Olympics, but World Cups as well, enabled FISA to implement all these changes. Another thing I pushed very hard on when I first became Director of Coaching for British Rowing, I introduced athlete representatives. So each of our squads had an athlete representative. I also introduced an appeals panel, which still exists now, so that if any coach or any athlete feels they've been badly treated, there is an appeals procedure that can take place. And I, at the same time, then pushed very strongly that FISA should introduce an athletes commission, which of course has been going for many, many years now. And I can't remember whether Martin or who was the first chairman of the athletes commission. But of course, the athletes commission gave a greater impetus for FISA to improve racing conditions. And then finally, later on, they introduced an events commission, separate from umpires. This was an events commission, which actually took on a lot of work for running events and a lot of the work that the competitive rowing commission, which should have been mainly about performance and coaching, just couldn't do everything. And Mike Sweeney, chairman of Henley Royal Regatta, was the first chairman of the events commission, and he also did a brilliant job. So there was a phase during the mid to end of 1980s when FISA really did ramp up all these improvements.
Fantastic. And it sounds like you enjoy fighting for a cause.
I had so many causes, it seemed to me.
Penny, you've been a clear example of leadership in rowing to bring greater equality to the sport, to bring greater careful scientific insight into what it takes to move a boat and how to challenge orthodoxy when the orthodoxy does not seem to be producing the results. I have no doubt that our listeners will agree that your careful approach to thinking things through is something we can all learn from. It's been an absolute delight having you on Rowing Chat today. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Long walk down memory lane.
We'll do it again.
Okay.
Until next time.